The man Rome put on trial that morning had already been condemned before a single witness spoke. A crown of thorns was pressed into his skull before any verdict was read. Blood was already running into his eyes before Pilate asked the crowd for its decision. And the crowd, whipped into one voice by men who had spent the night working them like iron in a forge, gave the only answer they had been prepared to give. The governor of Judea washed his hands in a basin of water, and the basin did not wash clean. In the space of one single revolution of the earth, from the moment the lamps were lit in an upper room in Jerusalem to the moment a stone was rolled across a tomb cut into limestone, everything that 2,000 years of civilization would debate, paint, sculpt, go to war over, and die for, happened. In the hours between supper and burial, the axis of the ancient world turned. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened, hour by hour, in the last 24 hours of Jesus of Nazareth, and why those hours refused to stay in the past. Friends, let us take a breath here. No one claims complete knowledge of what truly unfolded in Jerusalem that spring. The sources are ancient, layered, and argued over by scholars who have dedicated lifetimes to a single sentence. Your perspective matters. Write in the comments where you are from and what tradition, if any, you carry into this story. It brings the human picture to life. If this kind of careful, hour-by-hour historical reconstruction is something you want more of, a like and a subscription tells us to keep going. Now, let us continue. Jerusalem, in the year that Rome counted as the 18th year of Tiberius Caesar, was a city that had no business being as combustible as it was. By population, it was not enormous, perhaps 80,000 souls within the walls in ordinary months, swelling to perhaps 250,000 or more during the Passover pilgrimage, when Jews from Egypt, from Babylon, from the Greek cities of Asia Minor, from Rome itself, came to offer sacrifice at the temple built by Herod the Great on the crest of Mount Moriah. The temple was not a building. It was the architectural embodiment of a theological claim that one God, invisible, nameless in the deepest sense, dwelt in a specific place on earth, and that the blood of specific animals, offered by specific priests at specific hours, maintained the covenant that kept the world from unraveling. 46 years it had taken to build, according to the Gospel of John. Its outer court alone could hold tens of thousands of worshippers. Its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, was entered by one man once per year on the Day of Atonement. Even then, the high priest tied a rope around his ankle before entering, so that if he died inside, the body could be retrieved without another soul having to cross the threshold. This was the theological geography into which Jesus of Nazareth walked, not for the first time, during the week that the Synoptic Gospels call the final week of his life. He had been teaching in the temple courts. He had overturned the tables of the money changers. He had debated Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes on questions of resurrection and Roman taxation and the greatest commandment. And he had drawn crowds, not the polite, manageable crowds of a regional teacher, but crowds that made the chief priests and the elders genuinely afraid. Not afraid of the theology, afraid of the Romans. There is a detail buried in the sources that most people miss entirely. The Gospel of John records the reaction of the chief priests and Pharisees after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. The council convened, and one man, Caiaphas, the high priest, said something that John records almost as an aside, but which carries the entire weight of what was about to happen. "It is expedient for us," Caiaphas said, "that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish." John then adds a parenthetical note, extraordinary for its theological register, that Caiaphas did not say this of himself but was prophesying. The Greek word John uses for Caiaphas's statement is the same root word used throughout John's Gospel for the theological concept of substitutionary sacrifice. Caiaphas was making a political calculation. John was recording a prophecy. The man making the calculation did not know that both could be simultaneously true, and that in choosing to treat it as politics, he was stepping into a role older than the temple itself. Caiaphas did not know that the logic he was using, "one dies so that many live," was the exact logic he was trying to prevent from reshaping the world. The hour of the Passover meal is the pivot around which everything else turns. Jewish reckoning of time in the 1st century began the new day at sunset, which means that Thursday evening by the Roman calendar was already Friday in the Jewish reckoning, already the 14th of Nisan, the night of the Passover. The room had been prepared. Luke says 2 disciples, Peter and John, were sent ahead to arrange it. They were to follow a man carrying a jar of water, which was itself remarkable because in 1st century Jerusalem, carrying water was women's work. A man with a water jar in the streets of the city was a prearranged signal. The upper room was furnished, the table was set, the meal began, and almost immediately, the air changed. Jesus took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began washing the feet of his disciples. In the ancient Near East, foot washing was the work of the lowest slave in a household, the slave too junior to be assigned anything else. Peter objected. Jesus told him that if he did not allow this, he had no part in what was coming. Peter, characteristically, overcorrected. "Wash not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well," he said. Jesus told him that a person who is bathed only needs the feet washed. Then he looked at them all and said something that landed in the room like a stone into still water. Not all of them were clean. Judas Iscariot was at the table. The Gospels spend considerable energy on the question of Judas, and scholars have spent considerably more. The name Iscariot may derive from the Hebrew Ish-Karioth, meaning a man from Karioth, a town in Judea, which would make Judas the only non-Galilean among the 12. Or it may derive from the Latin Sicarius, a word for a hired assassin or daggerman, a term the Romans used for a specific class of Jewish nationalist assassin who operated in crowds. Neither etymology can be confirmed with certainty. What the Gospels agree on is the mechanics. Judas had already spoken with the chief priests. He had been paid 30 pieces of silver, the price set in Exodus and Zechariah for a slave or a prophet, depending on which text you reach for first. He was waiting for an opportunity to hand Jesus over without a crowd around him. At the table, Jesus said that one of them would betray him. The disciples looked at each other. John, who describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to Jesus. Peter leaned over and asked John to ask Jesus who it was. Jesus said he would give a piece of bread dipped in the dish to the one, and he dipped it and gave it to Judas. John records that after Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to Judas, "What you are going to do quickly." No one at the table understood what he meant. Some thought he was being sent to buy something for the feast. Judas went out. John adds 3 words, and it was night. It was, by rough reckoning, between 9 and 10 in the evening by Roman time. Late evening, the first watch by Jewish reckoning. The city still noisy with Passover pilgrims, the temple lamps visible from the upper room on the opposite ridge. What happened at that table in the next hour would redefine the language of sacrifice for the next 2 millennia. Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup, the 3rd cup of the Passover Seder, the cup of redemption, and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The theological claim embedded in those sentences is staggering in its context. The Passover meal was not a memorial of a general idea. It was the annual reenactment of the specific night in Egypt when the blood of a specific animal on the doorposts of specific houses caused the angel of death to pass over. Jesus was not abolishing that logic. He was claiming to fulfill it, to be the thing the Lamb had always pointed toward. The disciples at the table did not fully understand this. The understanding would come later, from the outside, after everything else had happened. Jesus spoke for a long time in that upper room. The Gospel of John devotes 4 full chapters to what he said, the longest continuous record of his teaching in any of the 4 Gospels. He spoke about his Father. He spoke about the Holy Spirit, whom he called the Paraclete, the Counselor, the one who would come after him. He spoke about the vine and the branches. "You are the branches," he said, "and without me you can do nothing." He warned them that the world would hate them as it had hated him. He prayed. John records the prayer in full, a theological document so dense and precisely structured that scholars have given it its own name, the high priestly prayer. He prayed for himself. He prayed for the 11 men in the room. He prayed for everyone who would ever believe because of their testimony. It is the only extended prayer of Jesus that any of the Gospels records verbatim. Then they sang a hymn, almost certainly the second half of the Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118, sung at Passover, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives rises to the east of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, a ridge of limestone covered with olive groves. The garden called Gethsemane, the name in Aramaic means oil press, a place where olives were crushed, was somewhere on its lower slopes. It was not far from the city. The walk would have taken perhaps 20 minutes. It was past midnight by Roman reckoning. The Passover moon was full or nearly full. The feast was always set by the moon, and the light was enough to see by. The disciples walked through it without fully understanding where they were walking toward. Jesus told them on the road that all of them would fall away that night. He quoted Zechariah, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Peter said he would never fall away. Jesus told him with precision that before the rooster crowed twice, Peter would deny him 3 times. Peter insisted more forcefully. All of them said the same. In the garden, Jesus asked 8 of the disciples to sit while he went further to pray. He took Peter and James and John with him, the same 3 who had been present at the Transfiguration, when his face had shone like the sun on the mountain. He told them he was deeply grieved, to the point of death, and asked them to stay awake. Then he went a little further, a stone's throw, Luke says, and fell on his face on the ground. What happened in Gethsemane in the next hour is among the most debated and most humanly raw passages in any ancient text. He prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." He came back and found the 3 disciples asleep. He woke Peter specifically and asked if he could not watch for even 1 hour. He went away and prayed the same words again. He came back and they were asleep again. A 3rd time he prayed. Luke, the physician, adds a detail that no other gospel includes. His sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. The Greek phrase is thromboi hematos, blood clots. The medical literature describes a condition called hematidrosis, in which extreme psychological stress can cause the capillaries feeding the sweat glands to rupture, producing a sweat mixed with blood. Luke does not analyze this. He records it and moves on. An angel appeared to him and strengthened him, Luke adds. The cup was not removed. He came back to the 3 disciples a 3rd time and told them to sleep now and take their rest. Then, almost immediately, he said, "Rise, let us be going. The one who betrays me is at hand." The torches appeared at the garden entrance while he was still speaking. Judas had brought a cohort. The Greek word spira can mean a Roman military cohort of up to 600 men or a smaller detachment. But it was soldiers and temple guards together, armed, carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. The signal Judas had arranged was a kiss, the normal greeting between a rabbi and his disciples, a gesture of honor. In the torchlight and the crowd, the soldiers needed a way to identify which man to arrest. Judas walked directly to Jesus and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" One of the disciples, John identifies him elsewhere in his gospel as Peter, drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus told Peter to put the sword away. Then he reached out and touched Malchus's ear and healed it. Luke is the only gospel to record this final healing, a physician's eye for a physician's detail. Jesus said to the soldiers, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." He said, "I am he." John records that when he said it, they drew back and fell to the ground. The Greek phrase Jesus uses, ego eimi, I am, is the same construction used for the divine name in the Greek translation of Exodus when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush. Whether John intends a theological echo or a linguistic coincidence is a question scholars have not settled. What is not disputed is that the disciples scattered and ran, exactly as Zechariah and Jesus himself had said they would. One young man, unnamed in Mark's Gospel, and scholars have long wondered if this was Mark himself, was seized and fled naked, leaving his linen cloth behind in the soldiers' hands. Jesus was bound and led away. It was somewhere around 1 in the morning. The city was still sleeping. The moon was high. The journey from Gethsemane back across the Kidron Valley and into the city through the gate near the pool of Siloam would have taken perhaps 15 minutes. They brought him first not to Pilate, not yet, but to Annas. Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He had been high priest himself from the year 6 to the year 15 of the Common Era, when the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus had deposed him. He had been replaced by his son-in-law, but in the eyes of many devout Jews, the high priesthood was a life appointment under Torah. Roman interference could not theologically transfer the role. Annas was still called high priest. He was the patriarch of a priestly dynasty that would produce 5 sons and 1 son-in-law, who held the office over the following decades, a stranglehold on the most powerful religious institution in Jewish life. Bringing Jesus to Annas first was a gesture of protocol, of family hierarchy. It was also a message. This was not rogue action. The whole family was behind it. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered that he had spoken openly in the temple, in the synagogues, that everything he had taught had been in public, and that Annas should ask those who had heard him. One of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus with his hand and said, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If I said something wrong, tell me what it was. If not, why do you strike me?" They sent him bound to Caiaphas. While this was happening, Peter had followed, at a distance, John specifies, and John was there too, because John was known to the high priest's household and was able to get through the gate into the courtyard. He spoke to the woman who kept the gate and brought Peter in. The courtyard had a charcoal fire burning in it because the night was cold. The servants and the officers were standing around it, warming themselves. Peter stood among them and warmed himself. The woman who had let him in looked at him and said, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" Peter said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of Malchus, whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied it again. At that moment, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Luke records that Jesus turned and looked at Peter across the courtyard. Peter went outside and wept bitterly. The trial before Caiaphas has no complete record. The Synoptic Gospels indicate a gathering of the Sanhedrin, or at least of the chief priests and elders, at Caiaphas's house in the deep of the night, which was itself irregular. Jewish legal procedure, as codified in the Mishnah, prohibited capital trials from being conducted at night, prohibited a same-day verdict, required trials to be held in a specific chamber of the temple complex. Scholars debate endlessly whether the proceedings described in the Gospels represent formal Sanhedrin procedure or an informal emergency council. The Greek and Hebrew terminology is blurred enough to support both readings. What the Gospels agree on is the substance. Witnesses were brought who gave contradictory testimony, including claims that Jesus had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and ultimately Caiaphas stood up and asked him directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus answered, and this is the moment that sealed it, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robes. He said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Then they spat in his face. They struck him. They blindfolded him and hit him and said, "Prophesy, who hit you?" It was now perhaps 3 in the morning, maybe 4. The darkest hours. Stars still out. The Temple Mount visible across the valley, its stones pale in the moonlight. At dawn, the Roman sources suggest somewhere between 6 and 7 in the morning, when the magistrates' courts opened. They led Jesus to the Praetorium, the official residence of the Roman governor. Pilate was in Jerusalem for the Passover specifically to manage exactly this kind of situation. A city swollen with religious fervor, the constant low-level threat of riot, the delicate diplomacy between Roman power and Jewish religious authority. The Praetorium was either in the Antonia fortress at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount or in Herod's palace on the western hill. Scholars still argue, and the archaeology does not settle it cleanly. What is certain is that the Jewish leaders who brought Jesus there refused to enter the building. Entering a Gentile house on the day of Passover would have made them ceremonially unclean and prevented them from eating the Passover meal. So Pilate came out to them. The exchange between Pilate and the Jewish leaders in the courtyard outside the Praetorium is a document of extraordinary political maneuvering. The leaders said they would not have brought this man if he were not a criminal. Pilate told them to judge him by their own law. He said they were not permitted to execute anyone, which was the whole point. Execution required Rome. Pilate went back inside and questioned Jesus privately. He asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus asked him if this was his own idea or something others had told him. Pilate said he was not a Jew, that his own people and the chief priests had handed him over. What had he done? Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. If it were, his servants would be fighting. Pilate came back out and told the crowd he found no fault in him. The crowd pressed harder. "He has stirred up the people," they said, "all through Judea, from Galilee to this place." When Pilate heard the word Galilee, he asked if this man was a Galilean. When he confirmed that he was, he sent him to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, who was also in Jerusalem for the feast. Herod Antipas had wanted to see Jesus for a long time. He had heard reports. He was hoping Jesus would perform some sign for him. He questioned him at length. Jesus said nothing. The chief priests and scribes stood there accusing him vigorously. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt and mockery. They put an elegant robe on him. Some manuscripts say white, some say bright or gleaming, and sent him back to Pilate. Luke records a detail that scholars rarely linger on. Herod and Pilate became friends that day. Before this, they had been enemies. It was perhaps 8 or 9 in the morning. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and told them he had examined Jesus in their presence and found no guilt in this man on any of the charges they were bringing. Neither had Herod. He proposed to have Jesus flogged and released. There was a custom, its historical basis outside the Gospels is debated, by which the Roman governor would release one prisoner to the crowd at the feast as a gesture of goodwill. Pilate offered to release Jesus. The crowd demanded Barabbas instead, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, asked again. They shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Matthew adds a detail that is echoed through history in ways neither Matthew nor those who first heard him could have calculated. Pilate's wife sent him a message while he was sitting on the judgment seat. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered greatly today in a dream because of him." Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Matthew records that all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." That sentence would be weaponized over the next 2,000 years in ways that should make anyone who has read what followed in history go cold. Matthew was a Jewish writer recording what Jewish eyewitnesses reported a Jewish crowd said in a moment of political frenzy orchestrated by a specific political faction. He was not issuing a verdict on a people. What happened to Jewish communities across Christian Europe in the centuries that followed? The pogroms, the expulsions, the blood libels, was not the fulfillment of this sentence. It was its corruption. Pilate released Barabbas. He had Jesus flogged. Roman flogging, the flagellum, was not a prelude to execution in the sense that it was light. It was designed to bring a man to the edge of death. The instrument was a short wooden handle with multiple leather thongs, each embedded at intervals with pieces of metal or bone. The victim was stripped to the waist and tied to a post. There was no prescribed number of lashes in Roman law, as opposed to Jewish law, which set the maximum at 39. The soldiers kept going until the officer in charge said, "Stop." The flesh came off in strips. Internal organs were sometimes exposed. Josephus describes men surviving Roman flogging with their bones visible. Many did not survive. The Gospels do not describe it. They name it in a single word and move on. After the flogging, the soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole cohort around him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They put a purple or scarlet robe around him. They put a reed in his right hand as a mock scepter. They knelt before him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him. They took the reed and hit him on the head with it, driving the thorns deeper. Then they led him out to crucify him. It was somewhere around 9 in the morning by Mark's reckoning. The Via Dolorosa, the path of the cross, is a matter of ongoing archaeological debate in terms of its exact route, but the destination was not in doubt. Golgotha. The word is Aramaic for skull. Calvary in Latin is the same meaning. A place of rock formations resembling a skull's eye sockets, outside the city walls, on a road where traffic passed, where crucifixions could serve their true Roman purpose: public, visible, humiliating death as deterrent. Jesus was made to carry his own cross, specifically the crossbeam, the patibulum, which would have weighed somewhere between 30 and 50 kilograms. He had been flogged within the previous hour. He could not carry it the full distance. A man named Simon from Cyrene, a city on the North African coast in what is now Libya, was coming in from the country when the soldiers compelled him to carry the cross. Mark identifies Simon's sons by name, Alexander and Rufus. The specificity suggests the original audience knew who they were, that Simon's family was known in the early Christian community. Simon of Cyrene is one of the most unexplained presences in the Passion narrative. A man from Africa, forced into the story of the world's most debated death, carrying the instrument of that death for the last stretch of road. Luke describes women following along the road, weeping and lamenting. Jesus turned and spoke to them. He told them not to weep for him, but for themselves and their children. And then he said something that reaches forward in time like a shadow. If they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? He was speaking of Jerusalem. 40 years later, the Roman general Titus would lay siege to the city, breach its walls, burn the temple, and kill or enslave hundreds of thousands. The women weeping on that road in the year of Tiberius did not know this. The wood was still green. They reached Golgotha. The soldiers offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic, a small mercy, and he tasted it but would not drink. The crucifixion itself. They nailed his hands, or his wrists, the Greek word care covers both, to the crossbeam, hoisted the crossbeam onto the upright post, and nailed his feet. A sign was attached to the top of the cross in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Pilate had composed it himself. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests objected to the wording and came to Pilate to ask him to change it to, "This man said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate said, "What I have written, I have written." 2 others were crucified with him that day, one on each side. Matthew and Mark call them lestai, a word that can mean robbers or bandits or insurrectionists. The same word Josephus uses for revolutionary fighters against Rome. They were not petty thieves. They were likely political prisoners, exactly the kind of men who might have fought alongside Barabbas. The soldiers divided his garments among them by casting lots, an action that the Gospel of John specifically identifies as fulfilling Psalm 22, verse 18. They sat down and watched him. The people passing on the road, and the road was public, and it was Passover, and there were pilgrims everywhere, hurled insults. They said, "You who destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself." The chief priests and scribes and elders mocked him in the same register. He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. One of the 2 men crucified alongside him joined in the mocking. The other silenced him. This second man said, "We are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." The word paradise, paradisos in Greek, is borrowed from the Persian word for a walled garden, a royal enclosure. The conversation between 2 dying men, one innocent and one convicted, over the head of a third man dying in the center, is among the most precise theological exchanges in any of the Gospels. No elaborate argument, no theological system. One request, one answer, one promise. His mother was there. John records it. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene. Mary, the wife of Clopas. John himself, the beloved disciple, the only one of the 12 who had not fled. Jesus looked down from the cross and saw his mother and the disciple standing near. He said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." He said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that hour, John says, the disciple took her into his own household. At the 6th hour by Jewish reckoning, noon by Roman time, darkness fell over the land. The Greek word for the region can mean Judea or the whole land of Israel or the whole world, depending on how the translator weighs it. The darkness lasted 3 hours until the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon. This is one of the most discussed details in the Passion accounts. A total solar eclipse would have been astronomically impossible on the 14th of Nisan, because Passover always falls on a full moon, and solar eclipses only occur at new moon. Ancient sources outside the Gospels record unusual darkness on this day. The explanation remains debated. What the Gospels record is the phenomenology, darkness at noon. Somewhere in the third hour of that darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. The words are preserved in Aramaic, the one moment where the Greek text steps back and lets the original language through, as if the tradition required it exactly. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in desolation and ends in vindication, a psalm that the early Christians read as a map of the crucifixion written 1,000 years before the crucifixion. Some bystanders heard the name Eloi and thought he was calling for Elijah. One of them ran and got a sponge, soaked it in sour wine, the common wine of the Roman soldiers, put it on a reed and offered it to him. Jesus cried out in a loud voice again. The exact words differ slightly between the Gospels. Luke records, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." John records, "It is finished." The Greek word John uses is tetelestai, a single word, but in the Greek of the commercial world, it was the word written across a receipt when a debt had been paid in full. Not abandoned, not failed, completed. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The veil of the temple, a curtain 60 feet high and 30 feet wide, woven so thick that 2 teams of oxen could not pull it apart according to the Talmud, was torn from top to bottom. An earthquake shook the ground. Matthew records that tombs opened and bodies of saints who had died were raised and appeared to many people in the holy city after Jesus' resurrection. This passage is found only in Matthew, is among the most discussed in all the gospel literature, and has resisted both straightforward literalism and comfortable allegorizing for 2,000 years. Matthew wrote it. He left it there. The Roman centurion who was standing facing the cross, watching everything, said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." It was 3 in the afternoon. The soldiers came to break the legs of the crucified men to hasten death. Jewish law required that bodies not remain on crosses on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath began at sunset. They broke the legs of the 2 men on either side of Jesus. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead. One of the soldiers took a spear and thrust it into his side, into the area of the heart, the pericardium, and blood and water came out. John records this with extreme emphasis. He who saw it has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. The medical interpretation of blood and water from the chest wound is consistent with the rupture of the pericardial sac, a consequence of either extreme cardiac stress or the trauma of the flogging, or both. The eyewitness who recorded it did not have the framework to analyze it medically. He recorded what he saw and swore to its truth. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, a member of the council, a man who had not consented to their decision, a secret disciple, went to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion could take days, and summoned the centurion to confirm it. The centurion confirmed it. Pilate gave the body to Joseph. Nicodemus came too, the same Nicodemus who had come to Jesus at night early in John's Gospel, and been told that unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. He brought 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Together they took the body, wrapped it in linen cloths with the spices, in the manner of Jewish burial. There was a garden near the place of crucifixion, and in the garden a new tomb, cut from rock, in which no one had ever been laid. They placed him there because the Sabbath was beginning. The sun was dropping toward the western hills. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and saw the tomb and how the body was laid. Then they went and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested, according to the commandment. A large stone was rolled across the mouth of the tomb. The chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate the next day, the Sabbath itself, and asked him to seal the tomb and post a guard. They were afraid, they said, that the disciples would come and steal the body and then claim he had risen from the dead. Pilate told them to make the tomb as secure as they could. They sealed the stone and posted the guard. The city fell quiet. The Passover moon rose over Jerusalem. The temple lamps burned as they had burned every night for generations, fed by the oil pressed from olives on the slopes of the mountain across the valley. The pilgrims from Egypt and Babylon and Rome were preparing to go home. In a garden east of the city, in a rock-cut tomb sealed with a stone and guarded by Roman soldiers, the thing that would not stay buried was very still. What Peter did not know, standing in that courtyard at the charcoal fire, warming his hands while his teacher was being questioned 30 feet away, was that the exact spot where he stood, the specific kind of fire, the cold air, the servant girl asking the question he could not face, would be recorded in 4 separate accounts by 4 separate writers and read by more human beings than any other scene of cowardice in literary history. He denied knowing Jesus 3 times. He wept, and then, on the other side of everything that followed, Jesus would rebuild him around a charcoal fire on a lakeshore, asking him 3 times if he loved him. The architecture of the restoration was built to match the architecture of the failure, stone by stone, question by question. What Pilate did not know, washing his hands in that basin while the crowd outside his window made its choice, was that his name would be inserted into the creed that half of Christianity recites weekly for the next 2,000 years. Suffered under Pontius Pilate. He tried to remove himself from the story. The creed ensures that every time a Christian says it, his name comes back. What Caiaphas did not know, standing in his torn robes and calling it blasphemy, was that the temple whose political survival he was protecting would be gone within 40 years, its stones thrown down one by one exactly as Jesus had predicted in the courtyard a few days before, its destruction so complete that the only thing remaining would be the outer retaining wall of the platform Herod had built to hold it. The thing Caiaphas killed Jesus to protect would be taken from him by the same Roman power that did the killing. The central truth of these 24 hours is not its violence. Crucifixion was common. Rome crucified thousands. The central truth is the specificity. This was not a general execution. Every detail had a name, a function, a weight. The garden was not random. The kiss was not random. The 30 pieces of silver corresponded to a text. The lots cast for the garments corresponded to a text. The darkness at noon and the bones left unbroken, and the spear in the side, and the burial in a rich man's tomb. Each of these corresponded to a text written centuries before, in a tradition that had been waiting for exactly this shape of event. Whether one believes this was fulfillment or coincidence, the pattern is there. The documents are there. The dates are as close as ancient history gets to certain. Type the word "finished" in the comments if you felt the weight of this account. Not as agreement to a theology, as acknowledgement that something happened in Jerusalem in the spring of the 18th year of Tiberius Caesar that refused to end when the stone was rolled into place. Share this with someone who needs to sit with it. Subscribe, there is more coming and you will not want to miss it. The tomb in the garden was new, cut from rock, and in it no one had ever been laid. The stone was Roman sealed and Roman guarded, and the soldiers sat in front of it through the long Sabbath night. The moon moved across the sky of Jerusalem exactly as it had moved the night before, and the night before that, and for every Passover in living memory. The oil pressed from the olives of Gethsemane, that same garden where the arrest had happened, where the prayer had been prayed, where the sweat had fallen like blood to the ground, burned in the temple lamps all night, illuminating the veil that had already been torn. The women came before dawn. Mark says it was very early on the first day of the week when the sun had risen. Luke says the dawn was breaking. John says it was still dark. The apparent contradiction has occupied textual scholars for centuries, and the reconciliation is simple enough once you understand that they were tracking different moments of the same journey. The moment of departure from the city, the moment of arrival at the garden, the precise quality of light at the tomb itself. They were not contradicting each other. They were different witnesses at different distances from the same event, which is exactly what the Gospels have always been. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, others unnamed. They had prepared spices and ointments in the hours before the Sabbath began and had rested through the Sabbath, and now they were moving through the streets of the city in the last cold darkness before sunrise, carrying their jars. They were talking among themselves about a practical problem. Who would roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? The stone was large. All 4 Gospels agree on this, and they had no men with them. It was a reasonable worry. It was the only problem they were thinking about. They arrived and the stone was already moved. What happened at the tomb in the next hour is the pivot on which everything that followed, every church built, every creed composed, every martyr executed, every council convened, every icon painted, every cathedral raised, every schism fought, turns. The accounts differ in their details, and the differences have been a source of both scholarly controversy and theological reflection since the 2nd century. But at the center, in the place where all 4 accounts overlap, is the same fact. The tomb was empty, and the body was not taken by the disciples, and something was encountered that the witnesses could not describe as anything other than living. Mark's account is the oldest and the strangest. An angel, a young man in white, sitting on the right side of the tomb, tells the women that Jesus has risen, that they should tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before them to Galilee. Mark's Gospel, in its oldest surviving manuscripts, ends at chapter 16, verse 8, with a sentence that has disturbed readers since its rediscovery. The women went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Greek word for astonishment here is ekstasis, the root of the English word ecstasy, but in its original sense meaning a displacement from one's normal state of being, a standing outside oneself. The women saw something that moved them out of themselves. Mark ends there. The story breaks off in the middle of its own aftermath. Later manuscripts of Mark add additional verses, appearances, the Great Commission, the Ascension, that most scholars believe were added by a later hand to complete what felt like an incomplete ending. But there is a case, made carefully by serious scholars, that Mark's abrupt ending was intentional, that he stopped precisely where the experience exceeded language, that the silence of the women is not a failure of testimony but its purest form. The silence did not last. Mary Magdalene ran back to the city and found Peter and John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, as John's Gospel identifies him, and told them the tomb was empty. The 2 men ran. John outran Peter and arrived first but did not go in. He bent down and saw the linen cloths lying there. Peter arrived and went straight in. He saw the linen cloths lying there and the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths but folded up in a place by itself. John then went in and saw and believed, though he immediately adds, in one of the most honest parenthetical statements in any gospel, that they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. They went back to where they were staying. Mary stayed at the tomb, weeping. She bent and looked into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white, sitting where the body had been, one at the head and one at the feet. They asked her why she was weeping. She said because they had taken away her Lord, and she did not know where they had put him. She turned around and saw a man standing there. She supposed him to be the gardener, and he asked her the same question. Why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? She asked if he had carried him away to tell her where he had put him. The man said one word, Mary. She turned. The Greek implies a full turn, a complete reorientation, and said in Hebrew or Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. This scene, in the garden, at dawn, a woman who came to anoint a corpse and was addressed by name, carries an echo that John almost certainly intends. In the Garden of Eden, the first conversation between God and a human after the catastrophe was also a question about location. Where are you? In this garden, the question is reversed. Who are you looking for? And the answer that ends the searching is a name. Not a proof, not an argument. A name. Jesus told Mary not to cling to him. The Greek me mu haptu, sometimes translated do not touch me, but more precisely do not hold on to me, and that he had not yet ascended to the Father. He told her to go to his brothers. He had not called the disciples brothers before this moment in John's Gospel, and tell them he was ascending to his Father and their Father, to his God and their God. Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. She was the first. This is not a minor detail. In first-century Jewish legal culture, the testimony of women was not admissible as legal evidence in a court of law. If the resurrection appearances were a fabricated story constructed by the early disciples to promote a theological claim, inventing a woman as the first witness, specifically a woman with a history of what the texts call 7 demons having been driven from her, was the worst possible strategic choice. The first-century reader would have immediately noted this as a credibility problem. The only explanation consistent with the evidence is that the tradition recorded what actually happened, regardless of the credibility problem, because the alternative, falsifying the primary witness, was not available to them. Mary Magdalene saw what she saw. It went into the record. The disciples themselves were in hiding. John says the doors were locked for fear of the Jewish authorities. The post-crucifixion period in Jerusalem was not safe for men who had been publicly associated with an executed insurrectionist, which is how the Roman authorities would have categorized Jesus, whatever the disciples understood him to be. The charge on the cross was political. His followers were, in Roman eyes, the followers of a man condemned for claiming to be the king of the Jews. The safest course was invisibility. Cleopas and an unnamed companion, possibly Cleopas's wife, possibly another disciple, were walking that same first day to a village called Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. A stranger fell into step beside them. He asked what they were discussing. They stopped walking. Luke says their faces fell. Cleopas asked the stranger if he was the only visitor to Jerusalem who did not know what had happened there in recent days. The stranger asked what things. They told him about Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, about how the chief priests and rulers had handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him, about how they had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. 3 days had now passed, and some women of their company had astonished them. They had found the tomb empty and seen a vision of angels who said he was alive, and some of those who were with them had gone to the tomb and confirmed the tomb was empty, but him they had not seen. The stranger called them foolish and slow of heart to believe everything the prophets had spoken. Then he took them through Moses and all the prophets and interpreted to them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. They reached Emmaus, and the stranger acted as if he would go on. They urged him to stay because evening was coming. He went in with them. He reclined at the table. He took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" They got up at once, evening now, 7 miles of road, and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together, and were told that the Lord had risen indeed and had appeared to Simon. Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. That phrase, the breaking of the bread, is a technical expression in the early Christian literature for the Eucharist, the practice instituted in the upper room the night before. The connection is deliberate. The action by which they recognized the risen Jesus was the same action by which he had told them to remember him. The recognition and the commemoration were, in Luke's telling, the same event. While they were still speaking, and this is one of those moments where the narrative velocity suddenly shifts, where Luke compresses something enormous into a single conjunction, Jesus stood in their midst and said, "Peace to you." They were startled and frightened and thought they were seeing a ghost. He showed them his hands and his feet. He asked if they had anything to eat. They gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. John's account of this same first appearance to the gathered disciples adds Thomas, who was not there. When the others told Thomas they had seen the Lord, Thomas said he would not believe unless he saw the nail marks in the hands and put his finger into the place of the nails and his hand into the wound in the side. 8 days later, the doors again locked. Jesus stood among them again. He said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas said, and this is the highest Christological statement in the Gospel of John, the culmination toward which the entire narrative has been building since the opening verse, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Thomas did not know, and this is the irony carried in the doubt itself. His insistence on physical proof would become the document of physical reality. His demand for the wound in the side meant that when he knelt before it, his testimony was the most materially grounded in the entire resurrection narrative. The doubter became the witness. The demand for evidence became the evidence. The appearances continued over 40 days, according to the Acts of the Apostles, written by the same Luke who wrote the third gospel. Paul, writing in what scholars date to the early 50s of the first century, within 20 years of the crucifixion, within the lifetimes of direct witnesses, lists in his first letter to the Corinthians the appearances as a chain of testimony. He appeared to Cephas, then to 12, then to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Paul's list predates the written Gospels. It is the earliest surviving document of the resurrection claim, and it includes the caveat that most of the 500 witnesses were still alive when Paul was writing, available for questioning. This is not the language of mythology. Mythology does not include addresses. The Ascension, Jesus taken up into a cloud on the Mount of Olives, with two men in white asking the disciples why they were standing looking into the sky, closed the 40 days. But it did not close the story. The disciples returned to Jerusalem and waited. 10 days later, 50 days after the Passover on the Feast of Shavuot, which the Greek calendar called Pentecost, something happened in the room where they were gathered that the Acts of the Apostles describes as the sound of a rushing wind filling the house, and what appeared to be tongues of fire resting on each of them, and they began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them utterance. Jerusalem was still full of Passover pilgrims. Pentecost came 50 days after Passover, and many remained or had returned, and the crowd that gathered was drawn from every nation under heaven: Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. They heard in their own native languages the disciples speaking of the mighty works of God. Peter stood up. The man who 3 times denied knowing Jesus at a charcoal fire, who had wept bitterly and gone back to fishing in Galilee, stood up in the street in Jerusalem in front of a crowd drawn from across the known world and gave a speech. He quoted the prophet Joel. He quoted Psalm 16, where David wrote that God would not abandon his soul to Hades or let his Holy One see corruption. He argued from the text that David could not have been speaking of himself because David died and was buried, and his tomb was in Jerusalem to this day. And then he said, "This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified." The crowd, standing in the city where the crucifixion had happened 50 days before, many of them present for the Passover when it occurred, asked, "Brothers, what shall we do?" 3,000 were baptized that day, according to Acts. The number is not incidental. 3,000 is also the number who died at Sinai when Israel worshipped the golden calf while Moses was on the mountain receiving the Torah. The Pentecost of Acts was being understood, by those who wrote it and those who first read it, as the reversal of Sinai's catastrophe. Where Torah written on stone had produced 3,000 deaths, Spirit given in fire produced 3,000 lives. The movement spread, not comfortably, not without cost. Stephen, one of the 7 appointed to serve the community's poor, was dragged before the Sanhedrin, gave a speech that reread the entire history of Israel as a history of Israel rejecting its own prophets, and was stoned to death outside the city, while a young man named Saul watched over the garments of the men who were throwing the stones. Saul approved of his execution. Saul then became the primary instrument of a systematic persecution of the new community, going house to house, dragging men and women off to prison. On the road to Damascus, where Saul was going with letters of authority to arrest followers of the way in the synagogues, a light from heaven brighter than the sun flashed around him. He fell to the ground. A voice said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He asked who was speaking. The voice said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Saul was blind for 3 days. He did not eat or drink. A disciple in Damascus named Ananias was directed to go to the house on Straight Street where Saul was staying and restore his sight. Ananias knew Saul's reputation and was afraid. He was told to go anyway. He went. He placed his hands on Saul and called him brother. Something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. He could see. He was baptized immediately. Saul, who became Paul, would write more of what became the New Testament than any other author. The man whose job had been to exterminate the movement became its most effective propagator. The letters he wrote from prison cells in Rome and Ephesus and Philippi would be carried across the Roman Empire and beyond it, read in communities from Britain to India, preserved through the collapse of Rome, through the dark centuries, through the Reformation, and read this morning in languages that did not exist when he wrote them. He did not know any of this when he was sitting blind in the house on Straight Street, 3 days without food or water, waiting for someone to come. The community that formed in Jerusalem in the years immediately following was, by all the available evidence, not an organized institution. It was a group of people, Jews, all of them at first, who shared meals and possessions and teaching and prayer and baptism and the expectation that Jesus would return soon. They remained observant Jews. They continued to pray at the temple at the appointed hours. They were not in their own minds founding a new religion. They were the people through whom the God of Israel had completed what the God of Israel had always been doing. The separation from Judaism, the slow, painful, generationally contested process by which what began as a Jewish sect became a distinct religion, took decades and was driven as much by external events as by internal theology. The single most consequential external event was the one Jesus had predicted on the road to Golgotha, weeping over the city, speaking of days when the enemy would cast up a barricade and surround the city, and hem it in on every side, and tear down its walls, and dash its children to the ground. In the year 66 of the Common Era, 33 years after the crucifixion, the Jewish population of Judea rose against Rome. The revolt was not spontaneous. It had been building through decades of incompetent and brutal Roman administration, the systematic humiliation of Jewish religious sensibility, the looting of the temple treasury, violence so nakedly provocative that even Rome's own historians described it with embarrassment. The Jews fought. For 4 years they fought. In the year 70, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem with 4 legions, approximately 60,000 soldiers with auxiliary forces. The siege lasted 5 months. The city did not fall so much as it was consumed. Josephus, who was present as an observer in the Roman camp, described scenes of starvation so severe that a woman ate her own infant. When the walls finally broke, Titus's soldiers set fire to the temple despite, according to Josephus, orders to preserve it. Whether this account is accurate or self-serving is debated. The temple burned. The fire was so intense that the gold of the menorah and the ritual vessels melted into the cracks between the foundation stones, and Roman soldiers pried the stones apart to extract the gold, which is why not one stone was left on another, exactly as Jesus had said sitting on the Mount of Olives while the disciples admired the temple's construction. The Arch of Titus in Rome, still standing, still intact, shows the soldiers carrying the menorah in their triumphal procession. The gold pressed from the olives of the conquered land paid for the Colosseum. The Colosseum, by one of those ironies that history deposits without comment, was then the site where Christians were killed for sport. The destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 was not the end of Jewish survival. It was also not the catastrophe that ended the early Christian movement. The Jerusalem community, warned by traditions they preserved, had fled to a city called Pella across the Jordan before the siege closed the city. The movement had already spread far enough beyond Jerusalem that its center of gravity had shifted. Paul had planted communities in Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi and Rome. The letters had been copied and circulated. The Gospels were being written. Mark's Gospel is generally dated to the years surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem, some scholars before, some just after. Matthew and Luke follow in the next decade or two. John's Gospel, the latest and the most theologically dense, in the last decade of the 1st century. By the time the last eyewitness was dead, the testimony had been gathered, sorted, weighed, circulated in multiple copies, across multiple communities separated by thousands of miles and multiple languages, and anyone who wanted to falsify it faced the problem that there were too many copies in too many places, held by too many people who had talked to too many other people who had been there. The Roman Empire spent the next 2.5 centuries attempting to end it. 10 major persecutions are traditionally numbered, though the historical reality is more complex. Persecution was localized and episodic for much of the period, rather than systematically empire-wide. But the trajectory is not disputed. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire of Rome in the year 64 and executed them in the arena and by burning them as torches in his gardens. Domitian, Trajan, Hadrian, Decius, whose mid-3rd century persecution was the first genuinely empire-wide attempt to require all citizens to sacrifice to the Roman gods or face death. Diocletian, whose persecution in the years 303 to 311 was the most thorough and most violent, the last great imperial attempt to extinguish the movement by destroying its scriptures, its buildings, and its leaders. None of it worked. The execution of one person who confessed the faith produced, reliably, a crowd who saw the execution and confessed the faith themselves. Tertullian, the North African theologian, writing in the 2nd century, made the observation that has been cited ever since. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He was not making a theological argument. He was describing an observable social phenomenon that had been confusing the Roman authorities for 150 years. The more you killed, the more appeared. In the year 312, the Roman Emperor Constantine, marching toward Rome to contest control of the empire with his co-emperor Maxentius, saw something before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, a vision, a sign, something he described afterward as a cross of light above the sun with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. Whether the vision was genuine religious experience, strategic political theater, or something in between is a question that has occupied historians since Eusebius first recorded it. What is not disputed is the outcome. Constantine won the battle. He legalized Christianity. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve the theological disputes that were fracturing the now legal church. He built churches over the sites in Jerusalem that tradition identified as the places of crucifixion and resurrection. He made the empire's relationship to the faith it had spent 250 years trying to kill into the relationship of patron and protector. The move from persecuted to established was not unambiguously good for the faith. Tertullian had been right. The blood was the seed. Establishment brought power, and power brought the corruption that power always brings. And the history of institutional Christianity over the next 17 centuries is a chronicle of genuine holiness and genuine atrocity in proportions that resist simple summary. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the wars of religion, the colonialism conducted under the cross, the complicity with slavery, the abuse of children. Any honest account of what was done in the name of the man who died on the cross at 9 in the morning on a Friday in Jerusalem must include all of this. The tradition itself has resources for this reckoning, its own prophets, its own reformers, its own willingness to name and confess. But the reckoning is real, and the weight of it is real. What does not change is the strangeness of the origin point. 30 fishermen and tax collectors and women and one reformed persecutor, in a period of perhaps 30 years, produced a literature and a community and a claim that 2,000 years of philosophy, persecution, and cultural change have not been able to contain in any single box. The scholars who argue against the resurrection on historical grounds must still account for what produced the movement. The scholars who argue for it on theological grounds must still account for the darkness at noon, and the blood mixed with water, and the question of what happened to the body. Both sides of the argument are, in their most serious versions, argued by serious people who have spent lifetimes in the evidence. This is the central refrain that the story of these 24 hours demands. What began in a single day refused to end in a single century. The instrument of Roman execution, the cross, the most public symbol of humiliation and state violence in the ancient world, became the most reproduced symbol in human history. The man Rome killed to prevent a movement became, by every measurable metric of historical influence, the most influential individual in the history of the civilization that killed him. What is your Barabbas? The thing you chose to free while something truer was handed over to be destroyed. That is the question the 24 hours leave in the room. Not a political question, not a religious question in the institutional sense, a personal one. Every person in the Passion narrative made a choice under pressure. Pilate chose his career. Caiaphas chose the institution. Peter chose his safety. Judas chose 30 pieces of silver. Joseph of Arimathea chose finally to step out of hiding. Mary chose to stay at the tomb when everyone else had gone. Simon of Cyrene did not choose at all. He was compelled, and carried it anyway, and his sons were known by name in the community that outlasted Rome. Type "risen" in the comments if you sat with this until the end, not as a creed, as a marker that you were here and you heard it. Share this with someone who is carrying something heavy and does not know what to do with it. Subscribe. The next video goes somewhere you will not expect. On the morning of the third day, the stone was not rolled away to let Jesus out. The gospel accounts make this clear enough. The risen Jesus passed through locked doors. He appeared and vanished. The stone was rolled back to let the witnesses in, to let them see for themselves that what they were afraid to believe was already done. The angel did not move the stone to perform the miracle. The miracle had already been performed. The stone was moved so the empty tomb could be seen by human eyes in the gray light of a garden in Jerusalem, with the dew still on the grass and the city beginning to wake across the valley. The tomb is still there, or what the tradition identifies as the tomb, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City. You can visit it on any given Tuesday. There will be a line.